Moral ideas are usually hybrid. On the one hand, they may contain truth about matters of fact, such as that arsenic is poison, or that a man with more than the desired courage will be called rash, and with less, a coward. On the other hand, in recording these facts, the moralist probably adopts and asserts in his own person the preference implied in those eulogistic or disparaging terms. He takes for granted that life is a good, that the approved degree of courage is a virtue, and that cowardice or rashness is a vice. He thus insinuates, as is self-evident, a moral judgment into his historical or psychological observations, and the possible truth of the latter may seem to him to support the truth of the former. But the nerve of moral judgment is preference, and preference is a feeling or an impulse to action which cannot be either false or true. It might conduce to clearness in this subject if we limited the term morality to actual allegiance in sentiment and action to this or that ideal of life, while the history of such allegiances and of the circumstances and effects involved would form a descriptive science to be called ethics or the science of manners. Truth in ethics would then be like truth in any other part of natural philosophy, and particularly rich and discoverable, because it would not require us to investigate the mysteries of physics or biology, but would accept the large material and historical facts on the human scale, would treat them as units, and would be satisfied with presenting them to the human conscience, to be judged morally. In this moral judgment, however, it is hard to see how there could be any truth. The only truth concerned would be that such a judgment was passed, that it was more or less general and lasting, and more or less passionate. But there would seem to be no conceivable object or reality in reference to which any type of morality could be called true. Yet, how many moralists or political philosophers are content with the support that physical facts and physical forces may lend to their maxims, and do not also claim a moral rightness for these maxims themselves? Such moral rightness and moral sentiment is either a tautology, meaning that what you prize, and what you want, or it is a tangle of confusion. Any first moral reaction, perhaps of anger, can harden into a fierce absolute command. Any feeling, nursed and kept close in the dark, may fester into a categorical imperative. The imperative of life, the imperative of every unchecked impulse, is no doubt categorical, and a certain group of these impulses may easily become a code of duty or honor, traditional in some society, or in mankind at large. Utility or calculation, or what Kant called heteronomy, may have nothing to do with such maxims. They may be as spontaneous and free as laughter or love. But how should these automatisms be true? The word true in such a case is unmeaning, except perhaps as a vague term of praise, a mere iteration of some automatic impulse, as if we cried Amen. Such repetition might seem harmless, yet verbal self-confirmation, coming to one's notions as it seems from nowhere or from above, tends to fanaticism. Language then becomes an accomplice and a sanction of the will, and from honest opposition to our enemies in battle, we pass to envenomed refutation of their feelings as false. Each party hugs its maxims not only as its own and worth being true to, but as the only true maxims. We might dismiss this as excusable heat and vapor, or as a technical solecism. Yet when passion usurps the name of truth, the very idea of truth is tarnished and defiled. Nevertheless, as usage leads us to speak of truth within the spheres of logic and of convention, so it leads us to speak of truth in morals. And there are good reasons for acquiescing in this extension of the range within which judgment may be called true or false. In willing as in knowing, there is a good deal of substitution and representation. Moral passions carried by words and ideas in themselves automatic may be deceptive, may be hollow. They may pass like storm clouds over the conscience, tragically misinterpreting the inmost and ultimate allegiance of the soul. Such passions and the judgments they dictate may be called false, since besides blinding us to many a matter of fact, they deceive us about our own fundamental needs and demands. Integrity, on the contrary, the clear allegiance of a transparent soul to its radical will, without being true to anything external, makes a man's choices true to himself. It banishes moral illusions. And the same true representation of latent interests may extend to political action. A government or a party may pursue true or false aims, in the sense of being or not being in line with the radical and permanent interests of the people. Thus, truth and error may be possible in morals, insofar as they are truths or errors in self-knowledge. Take, for example, the commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself. Purely hortatory as this seems, it may be almost entirely translated into propositions that would be either true or false. In the sphere of action, which, if we distinguish moral from spiritual life, would also be the sphere of morals, an imperative is an order to a dependent, intended to be, by suggestion, a form of indirect or suspended compulsion. A commandment to love would then be in reality an order to act as if we loved, implying that if we did not do so, our neighbors and God would act as if they did not love us. This would be a true or a false prophecy, and it might guide the will as might any other credible report about the field of action. But love, spirituality considered, is a feeling, and an imperative in the sphere of feeling becomes a little nebulous. How should love be commanded? It might perhaps be awakened by contagion, in return for love. Amor che a nolo amaro amar perdona. Or it might be extended from an object already loved to some kindred object. Then, in terms of pure feeling, the precept might run thus: love thy neighbor because God loves him, and thou lovest God because God loves thee. Or less emotionally, value others for their own sake because they too are centers of life and of values. Consider them, as Kant counseled, always as ends and never merely as means. In fact, and by nature, they are ends to themselves as much as you are an end to yourself. Here, in respect to all living beings, and not merely to other men, we reach a necessary truth, since life means precisely the power in organisms to grow and to propagate, as if they love their own being. Yet this ethical truth is not, and cannot become, a moral commandment. The categorical nerve of every imperative is vital. It expresses an actual movement of the will, and evident as the truth may be that life in every form has its intrinsic values, and attributes radiating values to all felt events, it by no means follows that these values are unanimous, or that life in one form can adopt, or morally ought to adopt, the interests of life in every other form. This would indeed be the death of all morality, not the perfection of it. The will of the storm, the will of Neptune or of Jupiter Tonans, cannot with self-knowledge be adopted by the struggling and trembling creature about to be destroyed. The will of the enemy cannot be incorporated into that of the soldier. The will of the tempter, the interest of a rival in love, the taste of the vulgar, cannot be weighed in the balance against the constitutive will and radical virtue of one's own being. Reason may harmonize the impulses of a soul. It would not be reason but self-betrayal if it abdicated these impulses in a brotherly compromise with cobras, monkeys, idiots, sophists, and villains. Against a threatening deity, there is always some protecting deity to be invoked. or some other side of the same deity. And license may be freely allowed to beasts and barbarians to live in their own way in their own preserves, so long as they do not trespass upon ours. Moreover, there is a mystical insight proper to spirit within ourselves, spirit not being specifically human, that perceives the universal innocence of life in the midst of universal war. But this insight cannot impose on the psyche in which it arises ways contrary to her native ways, nor has impartial spirit any reason for wishing to do so. Life is a form of order, a great rhythmic, self-responsive organization in parcels of matter, but it arises in 1,000 places and takes 1,000 forms. If reason or spirit or any mystic influence whatsoever attempted to impose on each living creature the contrary impulses of all others, it would induce not universal harmony, but universal death. It would solve the moral problem only by dissolving all goods, all arts, all species, and all individuals. Just because moral life is inwardly grounded, physical truths are the only guide that it will willingly accept. A contrary purpose merely arouses hostility, but a contrary fact may inspire caution. I remember in childhood the warning of my nurse against swallowing cherry stones. If I swallowed them, she said, a cherry tree would grow out of my mouth. This is the principle on which moralists usually recommend their system of morality. The preacher is honestly actuated by an unexplained intense sentiment which he wishes to propagate, and in order to do so he invents circumstances of a startling nature calculated to justify that sentiment. But the method is dangerous. The images evoked under such stress of feeling are likely to be grotesque, like the traditional picture of hell torments, or the atrocities imputed to an enemy in war. And even if by chance the invention were true, or the fraud never discovered, the sentiments thereby aroused in a half-moralized public would wholly lack the intensity and purity of those that originally animated the preacher. Where he was all moral enthusiasm or sinister superstition, his flock will be lazy, prudential, or prim. For that which creates morality is not facts, nor the consequences of facts, but human terror or desire feeling its way amid those facts and those consequences. Suppose that instead of laughing at my nurse, I had been horrified at my thoughtless sin and terrible danger in having swallowed a cherry stone. Then moral experience in me would certainly have become vivid. Sundry ethical truths would incidentally become unpleasantly clear, such as that a tree growing out of my mouth would be embarrassing, not to say fatal, or that other little boys lacking that ornament would probably jeer at me. From these ethical truths my mind would be expected to jump automatically to the moral judgment that annoyance, derision, and especially death are absolute evils which ought to be avoided. Life indeed involves the moral judgment that life is a good, since, while life lasts, the organism tends to maintain or to restore the continuity and harmony of its functions, defending itself with a blind, concentrated fury against mutilation, disease, and death. Even when in some tragic moment, reflection turns against instinct and prefers physical death to life, not everything in life is judged to be evil, for at least this high condemnation or renunciation of life is regarded as a glorious victory and liberation for the spirit. And what is spirit but the quintessence of life here purified into tragic knowledge, into clear loyalty to what is felt to be best? It is therefore an ethical truth that moral judgments of some sort are inevitable in man. He cannot help having some radical preference. However sublimated this preference may be, it will express his vital feeling, the last cry of his animal nature, morally groundless. This cry may be absolutely sincere and true to the heart, but there is no meaning in saying that the preference so uttered is a truth in itself. In strictness, we might even say that every moral judgment is repugnant to the truth, and that if consciousness fundamentally gave voice to truth rather than to life, and to the animal partiality involved in life, moral sentiment would be impossible. The cry, how beautiful, or how good, may be sincere, and it may be applauded, but it is never true. If sincere, such a cry is also never false, even if not re-echoed by the public conscience, because the public feeling that contradicts it can also never be true, but at best also sincere. Where sentiment is diffused and unanimous, if one person utters those exclamations, all the rest may no doubt murmur, "How true!" And indeed, to that extent, the judgment will then be true morally. That is, it will express the bias of human nature. That mercy is good or the sunset beautiful may be true dramatically and conventionally for the soul and in the speech of a particular moral society. A society that need not retract its judgments if by chance some harder head or colder heart contradicts them. Rather, it will judge those contrary judgments to be wicked and blind, and so they will be in respect to the standards of that society. There will be no further meaning, only a greater shrillness, in insisting that they are blind and wicked in themselves. If for the emotional words beautiful and good we now substitute the analytic words admired and welcome, all moral contradiction disappears, the fog lifts, and we restore our moral intuitions to their legitimate field, the field of self-knowledge. This Socratic self-knowledge is not scientific but expressive, not ethical but moral, and here, if anywhere, in the discovery of what one ultimately wants and ultimately loves, moral truth might be found. This is no easy discovery. We must be prepared for surprises in morals no less than in physics, as investigation and analysis proceed. As the blue vault vanishes under the telescope, so moral conventions might dissolve in an enlightened conscience, and we might be abashed to perceive how disconcerting, how revolutionary, how ascetic the inmost oracle of the heart would prove if only we had ears to hear it. Perhaps a premonition of this ultimate moral disillusion rendered Socrates so endlessly patient, diffident, and ironical, so impossible to corrupt and so impossible to deceive. I think, however, that there was one ethical illusion unextirpated from even the mind of Socrates, as also from that of Emerson, an illusion that warped the moral impartiality of his precepts and rendered him partisan and dogmatic in spite of his intention to be absolutely courteous and fair. He assumed that human nature was single and immutable, and the soul qualitatively identical in all men. The good that glimmered like buried gold in his own heart must lie also in the hearts of others, and only ignorance or sophistry could keep them from seeing it. But the roots of the good are alive. They are far more tentative and curiously entangled than verbal debate might indicate at Athens amid a bevy of rationalizing demagogues and sophists. Even in the individual in whom actual preference has its only possible seat, ultimate sincerity presupposes a definite psyche, with assignable aspirations, and indeed some degree of definiteness any psyche must possess. Else that psyche could not be the hereditary principle of organization in the body or of direction in the will. Yet this vital definiteness is not absolute. At each moment there is a limit, inwards, below which the psyche is not sensitive to variations in her own substance, and there is a margin outwards toward the infinite, beyond which what happens does not affect her specific life. Moreover, the most radical demands of the psyche are not immutable. Unfelt variations in her substance transform and undermine her desires. She is mortal. Presently she will make no demands at all, and in the interval, from germination to birth and from childhood to old age, she successfully develops and outgrows functions which are essentially temporary. In her origin, she was a new equilibrium that changing circumstances had rendered possible, and her organism remains always potentiality, plastic, and internal to the flux of nature at large. Hence the absence of a need or a passion in one phase of life cannot be taken for an argument that such a need or passion is false or wicked elsewhere. The contrary assumption is the root of much idle censoriousness and injustice in moralists, who are probably old men, and sapless even in youth, all their zeal being about phrases and maxims that run in their heads and desiccate the rest of their spirit. To reach moral truth, which like all truth is eternal, we should have to remember or foresee with absolute clearness the aspirations of all souls at all moments, and confronting these aspirations with their occasions, we should have to measure their relative vanity and physical compatibility. The question is not whether they happen to be identical or harmonious with our own sentiments. We are particular creatures at one point in space and time, and the most contrary goods are beyond mutual censure, if pursued at different times or by different spirits. Moral dogmatism is an attempt to stretch moral unity beyond the range of natural organization. Spiritually, it is a sinister thing, a sin against spirit elsewhere. Yet politically and within the living organism, animal or social, moral dogmatism is morality itself. It is the effort of that organism to maintain its health and attain its perfection. Hatred or contempt for alien manners and ideas would be absurd in a philosopher sure of his own ground. He would be pleased by their zoological variety, which, like that of animals in cages, would not seriously endanger his safety, freedom, or peace. But social morality, and all morality, is deeply social, is necessarily divided at home and threatened from abroad. Invective and propaganda are instruments in this animal warfare. They are useful in maintaining discipline, in breaking the enemy's spirit, and in capturing as many loose ambient forces as possible to the support of your particular regimen. Liberals and pacifists, who imagine they represent morality in general, are the first to announce the sure victory of their cause and the annihilation forever of all their enemies, that is, of all moralities in particular. Yet morality in general, as we see in truly emancipated circles, is no morality at all. The root of morality is animal bias, and to renounce that bias would be to renounce life. Even the most general and tolerant of moral standards, harmony, is not a good in itself. There must be an actual will directed upon harmony in order to render harmony a good. Harmony demands many a sacrifice. In what direction, and at whose cost, shall those sacrifices be made? A strong and well-knit nature, brave with the perfect harmony within, will despise and detest harmony on a larger scale. It will refuse to sacrifice any part of its chosen good, and will declare eternal war on the devil and on all his obsequious and insidious agents. Such, in whatever interest and on whatever scale, is the nerve of morality. Reflected in the living soul, all the rays of nature instantly acquire a moral color. Nothing can happen that will not be good or bad in 1,000 directions. When all living souls are considered, the crosslights and conflicts of these values spread an impenetrable tangle, through which it is impossible for a mortal eye to see the ultimate balance of benefit and injury. But nature laughs at this perplexity. A man is a man, for all the apes and donkeys in the world. Instinct reasserts its primacy. The overwhelming immediacy of some great passion or hope breaks through the cobwebs of sentimental idleness, and sets a fresh, clear work before us that will not brook delay. This self-assertion is not always young and impulsive. It may survive all experience and disillusion, growing firmer in isolation, and cleaving to the chosen good even when this is known to be unrealizable. Such desperate heroism is nevertheless contrary to all the lower, unconsecrated, yielding parts of the psyche, and half the martyr's mind, together with the mind of posterity, will judge wholly unrealizable desires to have been unhealthy and undesirable. Moral truth, therefore, even at its purest, by no means bestows moral authority over alien lives. It signifies only complete, enlightened, ultimate sincerity.